Thank you for joining us today on our webinar to celebrate Clinical Trials Awareness Week, and today being National Clinical Trials Awareness Day. I am Susan Hepworth from the Alliance for Patient Access and the Coalition for Clinical Trials Awareness. And today's webinar is titled Clinical Trials During a National Public Health Emergency. And we are very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Raymond Goodrich. He is the Executive Director of the Infectious Disease Research Center at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. So Dr. Goodrich, thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Before we get started in our conversation with Dr. Goodrich, I just want to let everybody know that at the end, after we have this conversation, there's going to be time for question and answer with Dr. Goodrich. We welcome you to submit questions at any time during the discussion, and you can do that down at the bottom of your screen. There's a little box called Q&A, and at any point, feel free to type in a question and send that to us. That way, once we get to the Q&A portion, we'll be ready to go right into that. So don't hesitate at any time to ask a question, and at the end we will go through all of those, or as many as we possibly can. So Dr. Goodrich, we will just go ahead and get started if that's okay with you.
Certainly.
And just to give those on the webinar a little bit of background, can you kind of talk about your background at Colorado State, what it is that you do, and how it is that you are involved in clinical trials?
Sure. Well, I serve as you mentioned, the Executive Director of the Infectious Disease Research Center here at Colorado State University. I'm also a professor in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Pathology here at CSU. And the IDRC basically is an operation that's made up of three components. One of those is serving as a part of the NIAID Regional Biocontainment Lab Network. These were facilities that were established in the mid-2000s by NIH to provide researchers, investigators, locations that they could do work that requires high containment biological research. So these are agents that you couldn't handle in a normal laboratory environment, but needed special facilities, special training, special infrastructure, and they help to provide the funding support to put this facility in place. From that foundation, some of the infectious disease research programs that had already existed here at Colorado State, as well as new ones that were established, began to grow and expand. The Research Innovation Center, which is part of the IDRC, actually houses private sector organizations that are working in that space, along with academic groups that are working in infectious diseases. The idea being to bring together these two communities to be able to work on problems that address a public need, address public issues or things that are important to the public, that private sector, public interaction and relationships that help to bring solutions to the table, whether it's in disease diagnosis, therapeutics, or production of vaccines against new diseases. And then our third arm of the IDRC is the Biomark operation, and that's our Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing and Academic Resource Center. And Biomark is engaged in a number of projects, both with government and private sector, other academic groups. It serves as a not-for-profit contract development and manufacturing operation that can do BSL-3 manufacturing of vaccines, of therapeutics, of diagnostics that require high containment biological processing. So a very unique asset to have in this kind of an environment. And again, the goal being to translate discoveries, basic discoveries, new inventions related to therapies or approaches to treat diseases, to translate those into practical methods and processes that you can scale and manufacture those products according to good manufacturing principles and practices. And so really the environment here is to create this opportunity, this ecosystem of innovation and invention where you can go from the bench to the basic research aspects of things that need to be done to translating those into products that can then be used in clinical investigation and clinical research to test whether, again, they're diagnostics for new diseases or therapeutics to treat new diseases or new vaccines to treat new diseases. Those are all things that we're engaged in and involved in. My own personal history is I worked prior to coming to Colorado State for 30 years in the medical device and medical products industry. And I served in that capacity doing a number of running the clinical trials program in the last part of my career for a large international corporation, developing medical devices for collection and processing of blood. And we did many clinical studies looking at the outcomes with the types of products through the regulatory process for approvals. Some of that is carried over into the work that I do here, which is primarily in transfusion transmitted diseases. We have trials, for example, that are sponsored by the US government in Africa to look at the prevention of transfusion transmitted diseases, things like malaria, HIV, HBV, HCV, some of those diseases which are not very common, thankfully, today in high-income index nations, but still pose considerable concern and issues for low to middle-income index nations. And so those types of activities are things that, as part of the IDRC, as part of my role here at Colorado State, those are the types of things that we engage in.
Fascinating work, Dr. Goodrich, and it sounds like you all are very busy. And we were just talking before we broadcast this webinar, and you said that, I mean, you guys have been working from day one, so there has been no sort of day off for you, and this is obviously such a critical time in the work that you're doing. And we're going to talk a little bit later. I might ask you some specific questions about, hey, can you give an example of what you're doing at your academic institution? So we'll get into that a little bit later. So thank you, and to you and all of your colleagues for all the work that you've been doing during this public health crisis. So I want to ask you, we seem to really be at a defining moment as it relates to COVID-19 and what's been going on really across the entire world in the last 2 months. This moment for our healthcare communities, for our scientific communities. Can you help paint the picture of just how big the challenge is that we are facing as it comes to trying to develop new treatments or even vaccines to prevent the spread of COVID-19?
Well, I think that, we're all aware that this has become a major focus of effort, and rightly so, because of the concerns and the global nature of it. Places like what we do here are to help prepare for those kinds of situations so that we're hopefully able to prevent, and if we're not able to prevent, we're at least able to respond in a way that reduces the impact of the disease in human or animal populations as well. Take a One Health approach to looking at these aspects of new diseases. The challenge is, of course, that when you're in, let's say, the worst time to be planning a fire drill is when there's a fire. You have to be ready for some of these things in advance, and that's very hard to do when you have a new agent, an emerging agent like the SARS-CoV-2 virus coming into human populations. We can apply many of the tools that we have developed in studying and treating other diseases, but everyone also requires its own specific therapy or its own specific diagnostic. So the pace at which things gets done is quick, but it doesn't seem quick when you're in the midst of the pandemic, or when you're in the midst of people being actively infected. So the challenge, I think, of advancing new therapies, new approaches to treating disease is that every time you develop a new medical product, there's a certain principle that you have to keep in front of you, and that is, of course, do no harm. And so testing and evaluation, both in the preclinical setting and in the clinical setting, is required to assure that the therapies that we're delivering or the solutions to the problem that we're delivering don't themselves create new problems. And the pace of that is often deliberate for a reason. because we want to make sure that we're delivering safe and effective products. Again, that's sometimes challenging and very hard to do when you're in the midst of a pandemic and you're looking for every possible solution to try to alleviate that, to try to overcome the problem. So the challenge is kind of staying true to the course of what's required to assure safe and effective products, while at the same time advancing these products through clinical trials and evaluations as quickly and efficiently as we can.
Yes. So I want to kind of talk now about three different buckets, really, because we're here today to talk about clinical trials and to really get your expertise, of which you obviously have a lot. So the first bucket, just to kind of give a little bit of background for those who are on this webinar, the first one I'm going to ask you about are clinical trials as it relates to therapies that have already been approved for perhaps another condition that are now being tested, pardon me, for the treatment of COVID-19. And then the second bucket I want to talk about are new treatments and therapies that are currently being researched and developed for the treatment of COVID-19. And then the third bucket being vaccines that are being worked on to prevent COVID-19. So I want to ask you, just kind of tell us about how trials work today for therapies that are already on the market but are now being looked at to treat COVID-19.
Well, I think there are several different approaches that can be used. One of those approaches, particularly for old therapies or other things that are approved for other indications being evaluated for treating COVID-19, is there's a pathway that the FDA has, emergency use authorizations, which allow products that have somewhat of a history behind them. They may be approved for another indication and treating a different disease. But there's some evidence that suggests that the particular approach may have utility there's data that supports that there's utility. And with the idea of trying to get both safe and effective products out there as quickly as possible, that's a mechanism that many organizations follow, whether they're developing a new diagnostic or they're developing a new therapeutic. Clearly, when those are provided, the idea is that there is some monitoring that is required. This isn't intended to necessarily put it into routine use from the start, but to allow the evaluation of it in a patient population to occur. Because although you may have products that are relatively safe and effective for treating the disease for which they're indicated, they've been tested thoroughly in those cases for those issues. Every disease poses its own challenges again, and how a drug or how a diagnostic behaves when you're testing it against this new agent may be different than how it's been applied previously. So there is some need still for evaluation of safety, evaluation of effectiveness, but there are mechanisms, the emergency use or expanded access types of approval processes exist. And I've seen a lot of that happening here with COVID-19. There have been a lot of products that have been used in other indications, used in other applications, some for which the base technology has been proven, in some cases for the diagnostics, and specific approaches to SARS-CoV-2 have been applied to those platforms. And I think the FDA has been very open to allowing those kinds of products to be evaluated to get something out there that could be helping people as quickly as possible without, again, with the intent of first and foremost, do no harm. So it's a balance, but there are mechanisms by which that can occur. And certainly, again, when you're in a situation where rapid response is essential, having access to things that have some proven, have maybe not the exact data that you need, but having some information available on them, it's a good place to start. While the more deliberate and more thorough evaluations of other more highly targeted, but maybe novel technologies is still in development.
So do you have any other information sort of on these drugs that are currently under investigation, they're already on the market for another indication. Do you feel like we've got some good options out there? Have you seen any sort of data that's publicly available that you could just kind of touch on quickly?
Well, I don't think I have any more insight into that, say that, just an individual, knowledgeable people reading both the press as well as the peer-reviewed literature that's there. I think many groups have attempted to try to get data out as quickly as possible. That has both pros and cons, as you can imagine, as well. Sometimes um, information gets out before there's a lot of peer review, before there's a lot of detail behind it, and that can drive things in a negative direction, quite frankly. Um, I think what it also does is it highlights the importance of different types of trials. A lot of these studies are done as observational studies where you're reporting, it was given to the patients, they seemed to recover, everything seemed to be fine. There's not necessarily a control group. There's not necessarily a placebo group. Again, it's a balance that you have to battle with between getting something out there and generating the information and following a more deliberate pathway that might design these trials in a little bit more rigorous way. There's a balance that has to be played off. So I think that a number of these agents that are coming out, there's some promising data, and I don't think that my perceptions or insights into that would be any different than, again, someone knowledgeable in the field reviewing it. There seems to be some promising information there. Larger trials certainly are warranted. Broader expansion of the access that people have to it are warranted. I think we have to continue to monitor and continue to look at the data and continue to evaluate it as it rolls out to see if those particular trends hold. And that's probably the case, with a number of different therapeutics, as well as with a number of different vaccine candidates, which are just starting to enter into the phase 1 and getting through phase 1, entering phase 2, now in some cases, clinical evaluation in humans.
So I want to move then to the second bucket, which are new therapies that are currently being researched and developed for the treatment of COVID-19. So these are not medications that are already on the market, not being used for anything else right now, specifically for COVID-19. And can you kind of give our viewers today a little bit of kind of what are some of the similarities between that first bucket we just talked about? What are some of the differences when it comes to the clinical trials?
Well, I think science builds on the history of what came before. In a lot of cases, some of the new therapies are new in their approach and their applications, but they're also based on sound scientific principles and observations that have been made with other products that came before or other approaches that came before. And there certainly is value in that. Um, the the I think the challenge is obviously, again, there may not be as much safety information available. There may not be as much experience, and certainly if it's a totally new drug or a totally new vaccine that's being developed, the lack of that information requires a little bit more caution, obviously. In moving forward, we could base so much on principles that are tried and true and experience with similar agents that have come before, but a little bit more caution needs to be taken in terms of evaluating those new materials for side effects or for adverse effects that might be induced by their use. It's a balance. You've got one side of the scale that is the benefit, and this is probably true in any clinical or new therapeutic or new drug development program. On one side of the scale, you have the benefit, and the severity of the disease and the negative outcomes that may occur in that patient population are the things that you're hoping to provide the benefit to by reducing the disease outcomes or the disease impact that it has in individuals. And on the other side of the equation, you have the potential side effects. You have the potential issues, both short-term and long-term, that may occur. As a friend of mine once said a long time ago, in a lot of these instances, we talk. It's easier to talk about diseases or complications of survivorship. So if you're dealing with a therapy or you're dealing with an approach that's going to make the difference between saving someone's life or having them just expire from the disease that they're suffering from, you may be willing and you may be able to take some greater risks with the types of approaches that you use. Um, that's a sliding scale, and I think it depends upon the particulars of any circumstances as to how far you go. It's always a risk-benefit equation that has to be calculated in every single case.
So many nuances to clinical trials, aren't there? It's not so
Yes.
cut and dry, as you just mentioned. Before we get to our third bucket, I just want to remind everybody on the webinar, if you have questions for Dr. Goodrich, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. If you just kind of hover your mouse over your screen, a black bar should appear at the bottom and you'll see a little Q&A box. And at any time, you can type in questions there and I will read those to Dr. Goodrich once we're done with this discussion. So I want to then move to our third bucket, and this seems to be right now, I mean, we're hearing a lot about vaccines. Pretty much every night on the news, there's a report about the latest data that's coming out. So talk to us about what those trials are looking like or what they are going to look like, since it seems like only a few of them have maybe started into the actual clinical phase of this. So just go ahead and talk about that.
Well, I think one that I think has been at the forefront of many of those headlines is the RNA-based vaccine that is being developed by Moderna. And that entered phase 1 clinical studies. There's some initial data, though not all of it, I think, available quite yet, that seems to indicate that the individuals who are treated with the vaccine are developing neutralizing antibodies, and that those neutralizing antibodies that are developed are very similar to the antibodies that patients who have contracted the disease and survived are developing. So that bodes very well for the potential of that. I think because of that, it's been given a fast track status by the FDA to move it into phase 2 clinical trials. And I think that's one that's advancing very quickly. You also have a vaccine being developed by Oxford University in the UK. That there's some recent, very recent, maybe even as of yesterday, information coming out from some of the early primate studies that were done with that. I think we still have to wait and see what that data tells us. I've seen mixed results that have been reported in the literature for it. But again, I think we just have to wait and see, which is hard to do in the environment where we're, again, trying to find something to solve the problem as immediately as possible. It's hard to say, well, this is going to take time. The example that I often give, because people ask me about the timelines, and I'm reluctant to say anything outside of what Dr. Fauci, who's far more well-versed and knowledgeable person in the field, when he talks about, 18 months potentially being the time frame going back to February when we may have a vaccine. And I think people react to that and say, why is it going to take so long? And the reality is, when you look at the history and you look at the requirements that are normally associated, he's already taking maybe 3 years off of the normal timeline that would be associated with developing a new vaccine candidate. It's really rapid what he's talking about. I use the example when Jonas Salk was developing the Salk vaccine. It took 7 to 8 years before they got through the first study with 1 million to 2 million children being vaccinated, and then declaring that they were seeing efficacy with that product. And that was in the face of a disease that was ravaging 40 to 50,000 people a year. So we've done a lot since that time to be able to accelerate, be able to have the tools to allow us to accelerate some of the development methods and improvements in clinical trial design, and improvements in in the way we do the development work itself. But 18 months is really a short period of time to have a product like this that would be available, that would be demonstrated to be safe, demonstrated to be efficacious, and available for widespread distribution.
So talk to us a little bit about the trial design. So it's going to be probably pretty different for a vaccine that it would be for a new or existing medication. Or if it's an existing medication, I think your target population would be people who have contracted the condition COVID-19. So can you talk a little bit about how the trial design kind of differs between those three buckets?
Well, the phase 1 trials are all about safety. And if you get some read on efficacy, that's terrific, but they're really not set up and they're really not designed to give you an output relative to efficacy. It's based on safety. And so you're really looking at how well an individual tolerates the vaccine. Are there any adverse effects either locally or systemically when a vaccine is administered? The other part, and one that you pointed out, is that you're normally administering the vaccine to healthy individuals. So these are people who volunteer to do research, to allow products like this to be evaluated, and they're healthy. And so you have to be cautious, of course, in those cases, because in that risk-benefit balance that I was talking about, there's a lot more on the side of risk than there is on the side of benefit, unless you look more broadly from the societal benefit of having a vaccine. But it's different in that when you're treating a patient, and that patient again is suffering from the ravages of the disease, you may be willing, you may be able in those settings to take a little bit more of the risk, because the benefit, if your drug works, is so much greater or outweighs the risks that are associated with the downside or adverse events. So phase 1 trials are basically to get a read on safety. Someone asked me earlier about how would I celebrate the clinical trials day. And I think I would celebrate it with the people and for the people who agree to participate and volunteer to participate in these kinds of trials. Whether they're healthy individuals, like in these vaccine studies in the early phase or early drug trials that are done often with healthy individuals, or they're patients. In some cases, patients who are trying out new drugs and new therapies that not necessarily for COVID-19, but for other diseases where the prospects are unknown and the benefit may be unknown to them, but they volunteer anyhow. My experience has been in many cases that's because they want to provide a legacy that might be a benefit from the research that's being done to someone who comes after, who may be able to better benefit from the drug being tried out in them. So I think it's a celebration of those individuals, but a little bit of a digression.
I totally agree with that. And I have just a couple of more questions.
Sure.
So, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to ask first. I want to ask this one first, and then I'll close with the other one. Obviously, because of our current environment, a lot of people are wanting to avoid going into hospitals, doctors' offices, and other places where these clinical trials may be administered, or they may be going in for observation, for checkups, things like that. So I would just like to get your perspective. How do you think the current environment is impacting, aside from COVID-19 trials, clinical trials more broadly, as they could be related, rheumatology, oncology, anything like that? Are trials right now kind of being negatively impacted by what's going on?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I mean, even from my own personal experience with trials that I'm involved in, the impact has been, you have to consider some of the practicalities of social distancing and interpersonal interactions that occur. When you're doing monitoring in a clinical trial, there's a lot of face-to-face interactions and patient interfacing that's required. And some groups have quite frankly said, we're going to hold off, we're going to wait, we're going to suspend enrollment until we get a sort of all clear signal or until things improve, because we don't want the fact that we're sending people out to have these kinds of interactions is going to continue to cause the spread of the disease. So absolutely, there's an impact. It's put a lot of things on hold. It's suspended a lot of programs that are ongoing. Hopefully those are not going to be impacts, though I fear that there are likely some that mean that things either have to start over or be abandoned. Hopefully, most people have been able to find a place where they can put a pause in until there's more of an all clear signal and those activities can pick up again. But I think just as other parts of the country and other industries are experiencing these kinds of issues as a result of the requirements and the provisions that have been put in place to help try to stem the tide and stop the spread of disease. I think clinical trial work and the pharmaceutical, the biotechnology, the industries that are engaged in that kind of research have clearly been feeling some of that impact as well.
So then this leads me to my last question, which is, I think a lot of people have heard of clinical trials throughout their lives. For most people, they've probably never had a personal experience themselves or even with a family member. So definitely, I'm thinking that just like we talked about how COVID-19 might be having a negative impact on some trials that are currently going on across the country, I'm wondering then if there is actually a silver lining for clinical trials more broadly that we may be able to take once we're past, this current pandemic. So I'd like to hear from you how this general, we've been kind of elevating the awareness of clinical trials. Many of us are now talking about it with our friends and family, like, oh, well, I heard that clinical trial was such and such about this vaccine, and we're hearing it on the news. So I think in general, it is maybe getting back on people's radar. They're reminded of what a clinical trial is, and they're reminded of that societal benefit that you mentioned earlier. So I would like your opinion on, is there going to be a silver lining, though, for clinical trials more broadly coming out of COVID-19?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think absolutely there will be, there could be, there will be. And, I work at a land-grant university, Colorado State University, and the mission of institutions like that are to serve the public through education, through research, through engagement with the community on issues that are important to the community. And it's important, I think, in that role that we provide the public with an awareness of what it is that we do and what it takes in order for some of these things to reach fruition in new drugs, new therapies, new diagnostics that aid in their health, in their well-being, in the field that I work in, and certainly in many other aspects of things that go on at other universities like Colorado State University. But I think it's incredibly important to have that, because the public stakeholders, they are the people who support the types of institutions that we work in. And whether it's a government lab, an NIH lab that's doing this work, or a academic group, or even in the private sector, I think the public has a right to know and has a right to see how this process works, what the requirements are, what it takes to move these things forward. And certainly this event, which has heightened the awareness of some of these requirements and the awareness of the pitfalls and the benefits that arise from these processes. I think that's important for the public stakeholders, the people who provide the support for what we do, to know and be aware of. It has to go hand in hand, by the way, with an equal commitment that the story that we tell is an accurate one and a true one, that we provide insights into what's going on, and that we provide the full story about what's going on, because it's easy to get caught up as well in the misinformation that floats around. And so I think if we stay true to the commitment of telling the story accurately and correctly, and with as much information as we can, I think that ultimately that does create a better public awareness of these requirements and the issues associated with doing clinical work, and hopefully increased support translates to increased support for those efforts and for the activities that are required in order to bring new products and solutions to problems like this forward.
I just have one final question for you. In your opinion, if you could just name one thing that would be key to helping to find a cure or a treatment for COVID-19 or any other disease that presents itself, what do you think that is? Do you think it's that we need more money to conduct this research? Do you think we need more support from the public? Do you think you need more clinical trials engagement? Like, if you could just pick one thing that you think if we had unlimited that, we would be able to really accelerate innovation.
Well, this is my personal opinion. I don't think money is the problem. I mean, with the trillions and the billions that are floating around, you would think that you just have to raise your hands and a few million would fall into it. That's not the way it happens. But I don't think it's the money. I think it's how we use that money, how we apply it. And creating the locations and providing the support for the research to go on ahead of the crisis, to either avert the crisis or respond to the crisis, to me is the best way to spend those dollars. Because regardless of how much money we spend, it was already too late by the time that a new disease like COVID-19 emerged into human populations and started to spread. It's too late to start from scratch. And I think we can be thankful that there were institutions and places that had already been established to be able to look at aspects of isolating the virus, characterizing the virus, growing the virus, starting to develop therapeutic, and had the tools to do diagnostics and other vaccine approaches to dealing with the disease. Imagine if those had not been in place. And although, again, we may not be happy with the pace or think it could be done better, imagine what it would be without that in place. And so I think providing the support, and it's hard to do sometimes. Again, another friend of mine told me many years ago, it's much easier to sell cure than it is prevention. We will spend a lot to get a cure, but we won't necessarily spend a lot to make sure that we have infrastructure and other things in place to prevent the next disease from happening. And another one will happen. Nature is very persistent. We've had other agents like Ebola, like Zika, like chikungunya, dengue, others that have emerged into human populations and spread. In many ways, those are bullets that we dodged. But nature is persistent, and eventually it finds a way for these kinds of things to happen, for the spread to occur. And the SARS-CoV-2 virus is just one example of that happening. There probably will be more in the future. It's hard to predict when, it's hard to predict where. But I think that if we invest in putting the infrastructure in place and maintaining it, allowing people to do the research, not when the disease is in outbreak, but before it is in outbreak, then we'll be better prepared and we'll be better able to respond.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Goodrich. This has been a fascinating discussion. I want to just remind everybody, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in now into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. I've got one here, so let me read it. So the question is, clinical trials typically have a control group, which you mentioned, who receive a placebo rather than the treatment that's being tested. Has the need for speed in discovering treatments changed this?
I don't think that it changes it from the standpoint of really wanting to know, do you have an effective therapy, or is this something that's, and how effective is it over the placebo, which uh, isn't intended to offer a cure. It may change the timing at which those kinds of studies are implemented. As I mentioned, there's a desire to move quickly. Safety has to come first. So I think I I don't believe that, and I don't think it's been a case where we've compromised safety. But then it's a rush to efficacy. And getting the answer to that as quickly as possible has been something which is, there have been a lot of observational trials without control groups. Does the current situation mean that we shouldn't do that? No, I don't believe so. I think eventually we will come back to evaluating that in the longer term. But I think there's also been a push to try to get solutions out there as quickly as possible, again, because the damage is so great right now that we're willing to take a little bit more risk in order to get some solutions in place.
Great. We have another question, and that is, how are you collaborating with other researchers in universities?
Yeah. Well, universities, private sector, other government institutions, as I mentioned, we serve as a regional biocontainment laboratory. So we work with a number of different groups that don't have BSL-3 handling capabilities, but need it in order to study this disease. So we work with groups to look at animal models for disease, and ways of being able to assess the efficacy both in vitro and in vivo for new therapeutics, testing efficacy. My group and my colleague, Dr. Richard Bowen, group here is involved in some of the animal models and some of the testing for antibody using a plaque reduction neutralization test, which is normally performed with the live virus. And again, that's something that has to be done in the BSL-3 facility. So we're working with both other academic groups and private sector companies that are developing technologies that you could do antibody testing outside of a BSL-3 laboratory, but we're correlating the results that they get with the data that we generate on the actual neutralizing antibody for the virus itself. We're also working with groups that are collecting and processing convalescent plasma. That's been a product that is one of those older products or older style of technologies for treating disease. You have to have obviously survivors, which we do in the case of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. And you collect plasma. The theory being, of course, that you have antibody present, which can help patients in the acute phases of disease to neutralize the virus and either temper, reduce the impact of the disease, or shorten the duration of it in those patients. But knowing what the antibody levels are, knowing when they appear, when they disappear, how long they're persistent in patients who survive and are able to donate the plasma, those are all questions that have not been known. And so we've been working with a number of groups here locally in Colorado and nationally to look at the convalescent plasma and to get some answers to those types of questions as well. And then also we work with other groups testing new vaccine formulations, and we ourselves are developing a couple of different vaccine formulations. My group is engaged in the development of a new vaccine called Solavax, which is based on an old technology to inactivate pathogens in blood products. And we're using it to create a whole inactivated viral vaccine that can be used and manufactured rapidly to produce large volumes of an inactivated vaccine that might be useful. And we're testing that in animals right now. Dr. Greg Dean's group here is developing a vaccine based on a lactobacillus platform for presenting antigen. And then we have a couple of other groups here that are also working on alternative vaccine platforms. And then we support work that comes to us from external groups with other candidates. We're certainly not just about trying to develop something on our own. If we can, and we can contribute to that, that's fantastic. But if we can help someone else get to the finish line faster, we want to do that as well, because the main priority is solving the problem.
That's great to hear. I was actually going to follow it up kind of with a question of my own is, are people, do you feel like at this stage more eager to work together? And it kind of sounds like people are, because we just want to get this across the finish line, as you said. So
I think,
good to
you
hear.
know, COVID-19 has been bad for a lot of things and a lot of reasons. I think amazingly, one of the things that I've seen is that the number of collaborations and the number of people coming forward to put their talents and their abilities and their knowledge on the table to help solve the problem, first and foremost, it's just incredible. I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and I don't think any time in my career have I seen that level of cooperation, collaboration, brainstorming, problem solving, public sector, private sector, government agencies, government labs coming together with the common goal of solving the problem. And again, what I've experienced in my life and in my career is that it takes many of those groups collectively to be able to solve a problem of this magnitude. I don't think anyone on their own can do it. So ways that we can find to enhance those networks, to enhance those collaborations, just helps us to get to the solution to the problem faster.
That's great to hear. I think we probably just have one more question here. And this is interesting. This person says, I've read in reports that there is a mutation in COVID-19. And how would a mutation affect the development of a vaccine?
Yeah, I think, it's common across all viruses that you get mutations that result in differences in types of proteins that are expressed. I think the impact is different depending upon the type of the rate at which that mutation occurs, and the type of vaccine that's being developed. If your mutation occurs within a protein that you're using as a subunit protein, for example, that you're using to immunize a person against, if that mutation results in the virus now having the ability to be able to escape the effectiveness of that immunization, then it reduces the likelihood that the vaccine is going to be effective. If you have a technology that can rapidly adapt to changing the nature of the immunogen, the vaccine that you're using, then you can respond to that by creating different versions of the vaccine that are specific to the strain or to the type of mutation that has occurred, that's present now in much larger populations. So that's a natural phenomena. It's going to happen. It will happen with COVID-19. It happens with other viruses. It doesn't mean that we cannot develop an effective vaccine strategy, but how we treat, what strategy we develop and how we approach it may have to be different, or it could be similar to other vaccines depending upon the frequency with which those mutations occur.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goodrich. I certainly know that there's been a few key takeaways that I have learned from this, and I think that that's the emphasis on collaborating and wanting to work together to come to a solution, I think is excellent to hear. It's one of these silver linings. I think that people are now more aware of clinical trials, and that in the future they might start asking their doctor, hey, is there a clinical trial that I might consider enrolling in for my specific condition? I think it's a huge upside there. And so those are just a couple of the big takeaways I got from today. So thank you so much, Dr. Goodrich. We appreciate you joining us.
It's my pleasure, and happy Clinical Trials Day.
Yes, happy Clinical Trials Day to you as well. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining.